Welcome to the presentation of Predatory Academic Journals and Conferences, which will be presented by my colleagues, Professors Lai-Meng Loy, Stefan Eriksson, and Asfa Asrat Kasai, and myself, Professor Ana Maria Cheto. Between us, we will cover the major aspects of this study, namely, who we are and why we are here, what has motivated this study, and what are its objectives. Second, why is it important to address predatory academic practices, particularly with regards to journals and conferences? Then, resources and tools that can be used to identify them. And last but not least, what can you do to minimize your own risk and that of your colleagues and students? So let me give you a bit of background. Our 2-year IAP study was launched in May 2020, and it will report in early 22. So that means that everything we present here is a pre-publication preview of some of our findings in an effort to share our learning with you at the earliest opportunity. The motivation for this study is the increase that has been observed both in scale and sophistication of predatory academic practices and their potential long-term damage they may cause if they are left unchallenged. The study is led by a group of experts from wide-ranging countries and disciplines who were nominated by IAP Academy members and other sister networks. So in Africa, the expert group comes from South Africa, Ethiopia, Egypt, and Benin. In Asia, from Bangladesh, Malaysia, and Jordan. In the American continent, from Mexico and Brazil. And in Europe, from Sweden, Ireland, and Italy. And as you can see on the next slide, our role has been to firstly, try to identify and define predatory and unethical practices in academic journals and conferences. Secondly, to gauge their prevalence and impact. Then to understand what is it that drives such predatory practices. Then to examine the efforts that have been made to date to combat predatory journals and conferences in the various regions of the world. And last but not least, to provide concrete recommendations for addressing the problem. The study speaks to the system as a whole, that is, to key stakeholders whose action can effect systemic change. Each of us will need to play their part, and this includes all of you. So firstly, let's run through some of the common features of so-called predatory journals and conferences. Noting, however, that they are called different things in different countries, such as spurious, fraudulent, trash, garbage, hijacked, dark, deceptive, among others. Whatever their terminology, broadly speaking, it is common that predatory journals and conferences solicit articles from researchers through practices that exploit the pressure on them to publish and present their work. Features of predatory practices include, although they are not limited to, offers to publish rapidly using pay-to-publish or present models with rigorous peer review known at all, perhaps, or without rigorous peer review. Fake editorial boards or conference boards, even falsely listing respected scientists or respected institutions. Another practice is the use of fraudulent impact factors or metrics. And we also observe the use of journal and conference titles that are deceptively similar to legitimate ones. Lastly, aggressive spam invitations to solicit articles and abstracts, including outside of a researcher's own expertise. These are just some of the examples. Such genuinely fraudulent practices continue to evolve. And it is becoming more and more difficult to distinguish between low quality, unethical, and questionable publishing and conferences practices. So over to Lai Meng to continue our presentation.
As part of our study, and in order to gauge the prevalence and impact of these predatory practices, we have conducted the largest survey of its kind on this important topic, a global landmark survey of researchers. Over 1,800 researchers from 112 countries responded to the survey, providing a rich data set for analysis. All major geographical regions of the world were represented, as were disciplines and career stages. Just over half of the respondents were members or alumni of national or global academies. If you participated, thank you. We have learned a great deal. In fact, the data are stark. Over 80% of respondents perceive that predatory journals and conferences are already a serious problem and on the rise in their country of work. At least 24%, nearly a quarter, of all respondents have either published in a predatory journal or participated in a predatory conference, or don't know that they have. When asked why, the main reasons were lack of awareness, needing to advance the career, convenience, one or more of fast, cheaper, easier, and peer pressure. This highlights the need for systemic and institutional change to reduce perverse incentives for using these predatory practices and prevent their normalization, and to improve legitimate publishing and conferencing good practice. Over 90% of the survey respondents think predatory practices should be combated. Why? To preserve the integrity of and public trust in research, and to ensure that research informing policy is rigorous. Let us unpack this a bit more. If left unchallenged, the majority are concerned that poor and inaccurate research fueling misinformation in public policy will prevail. No doubt, an issue that has already been brought into stark relief by COVID-19. The next highest concerns were the risks of undermining the research enterprise as a whole, not least public trust in it, and widening the gap still further between high and low income countries. This survey tells us that predatory journals and conferences may have infiltrated a wider demographic of researchers than previously thought, with researchers at all career stages needing to be on their guard, especially in low and middle income countries, and in some disciplines more than others. A significant proportion of respondents, as much as 14%, have admitted they have published in a predatory journal or participated in a predatory conference. The majority of them unknowingly. Using this 14% as a conservative estimate and the survey sample as a rough proxy for the global research community, if extrapolated, this could equate to at least 1.2 million researchers and billions of dollars in wasted research costs based on figures in the UNESCO Science Report of 2021. This is not a trivial or marginal issue. It requires urgent attention. So what can we do about it? Over to Stefan to help us.
Thank you. One of the major issues regarding predatory journals has been how to characterize them, define them, or mark them, so that the academic community can avoid such publishers as much as possible. In our survey, the respondents highlighted a few markers of a predatory journal, all with the focus on the invitations to publish that they spam you with. More than 80% of the respondents said that these are typical features. The invitation to submit a paper is in a subject outside your expertise. The conference or journal has an unusual combination of words in the name. The invitation is unfocused, the language odd, and it can be very flattering. And they keep sending you invitations, that is, spamming you. Most researchers have indicated there is little in the way of institutional policy or guidance on how to recognize and avoid predatory journals and conferences. There are nevertheless a range of self-help resources already available online to guide researchers, especially with respect to journals, but less so conferences. Here are a few examples. Some of these are publicly available, like AuthorAid, while others, like Cabell's, are pay-for subscription services. The Directory of Open Access Journals is a community-curated online directory that indexes and provides access to high-quality, open-access peer-reviewed journals. Cabell's is listing the journals to avoid, on the other hand. ThinkCheck Submit is a widely used resource for helping you check journals and is available in nearly 40 languages, from Albanian to Vietnamese. ThinkCheck Attend is a similar resource for conferences, a tool helping scholars to judge the academic credential of conferences. Most recently, the Ottawa Health Research Institute has developed what they call a one-stop shop of resources on predatory journals, which went live this year. It is designed to help researchers and clinicians, research funders and academic institutions, and journalists, patients, and the wider public. They have also produced a consensus definition of predatory journals. It reads like this: predatory journals and publishers are entities that prioritize self-interest at the expense of scholarship and are characterized by false or misleading information, deviation from best editorial and publication practices, a lack of transparency, and/or the use of aggressive and indiscriminate solicitation practices. Now, one of the key conclusions of our work is that most definitions and tools do not account sufficiently for complexity. It can be rather difficult to distinguish between fraudulent, low quality, questionable, and unethical practices in publishing and conferencing, as illustrated by at least 10% of our survey respondents who indicated that they didn't know if they had used predatory outlets. So we have instead developed a tool or a spectrum of predatory behaviors as a more nuanced approach to help researchers assess their risk. So following the consensus definition but replacing journals with the notion of practices, we define predatory practices as predatory practices are practices in scholarly publishing that prioritize self-interest at the expense of scholarship. This makes it possible, we argue, to distinguish fraudulent or deceptive journals from low-quality ones, as well as recognizing that there may be low-quality ones in need of support rather than being damned as predatory. But also to recognize reputable quality journals that could be criticized for prioritizing self-interest at the expense of scholarship. Looking at the spectrum, we have on the left fraudulent journals, deceptive journals, and unacceptably low-quality ones. Author advisory for these categories are that these three are in the red, so to speak, and are absolute no-go zones. In the middle, we have low-quality journals. Arguably, this gray zone is becoming increasingly larger, making it harder and harder to distinguish whether journals can be trusted. Our author advisory here is, well, beware. If these have many predatory markers, the advice is clearly to not publish here, though some of the journals may not be called predatory journal outright. Towards the right, we have promising low-quality journals, upcoming journals, trying but failing, you could say. Author advisory here is not the best place to publish, but you may publish with care if finding them worthy of support. It will not perhaps be an offense to publish here, but you may not get full credit. Then question journals, that is, quality journals questioned about possibly predatory practices. They would typically either take proper action when criticized for possible predatory practice and thus be okay to publish with, or failing that, become a low-quality outlet that authors should be aware of. And finally, on the right, quality journals. Author advisories, of course, this is where to publish, though often easier said than done. Unscrupulous authors may exploit the second right and third right categories. Equally, journals in these categories may scavenge on these authors. In the near future, more harm to evidence-based learning may be caused by these two categories than the three categories on the far left that are probably easier to recognize as predatory. The more original contribution of the IAP study is to draw attention to questionable practices on the right. In our report, we set out typical markers in each part of the journal's spectrum. Fraudulent journals typically engage in internet fraud of various kinds. Deceptive journals typically lie about its true nature, services provided, or costs involved in publishing with them. Low-quality markers add up. The more of them you exhibit, the worse you are. Such markers involve the quality of peer review, editorial services, or how manuscripts are handled, as well as compliance with recognized best practices in scientific publishing. A similar spectrum has been developed for predatory conferences, where we won't discuss in the interest of time here, but as you can see, it operates on a similar advisory principle, ranging from fake, fraudulent conferences to low-quality, questionable, and high-quality ones. And again, in our report, we set out typical markers in each part of the conference's spectrum. Like the journals, we find the worst offenders being those that are scamming conference attendees, lying about who is going to talk, etc. Low-quality markers include badly organized conferences with too broad a scope, lacking focus. Not least, they typically spam scientists with invitations, often asking for them to talk on subjects outside their expertise. And now finally, we hand over to Asfa to run through what you can do to minimize your risk.
Thank you. Practice due diligence to minimize your risk of using predatory outlets. Remember, the time you invest in researching an appropriate journal or conference is only a fraction of the time you spend on preparing your manuscript for publication or your abstract and slides for presentation. So use the predatory journals and conference spectra and other available guides and resources such as Think, Check, Submit and Think, Check, Attend. Do not rely exclusively on imperfect watch lists and safe lists, and you familiarize yourselves with the common and most reliable traits of predatory practice. If they meet more than 2 of these, then this should ring alarm bells and they should be avoided. If a journal claims that it is indexed in a reputable index, such as Scopus or Web of Science, check this for yourselves. If it's not true, the journal should be avoided. Check if a journal is listed in the directory of open access journals. If it is, the journal is less likely to be problematic because it has been vetted. Similarly, if a journal is a member of the Committee on Publication Ethics or COP, where it must follow COP's publication ethics, then it is likely to be safe. And if your institution has its own lists of acceptable and unacceptable journals or subscribes to CABEL's predatory reports, use them with caution and cross-check with other resources we have included in our study. And seek advice from your mentor or supervisor, but if they are unsighted themselves, then encourage them to train up. And stop knowingly publishing in or citing predatory journals or presenting at a predatory conference. Do not act as reviewers for them or sit on their editorial committees, and consider the harm to your academic career and that of your students or your research team, as there may be serious personal repercussions, serious scientific consequence, and the risk of losing your work forever. And remember, as a general rule, spam emails are invariably scam emails. Here are a few anecdotes from researchers who completed our survey, illustrating the personal and professional impact publishing in a predatory journal can have. A researcher said publishing in a predatory journal became a really black dot in their career, while a graduate student lamented that it has delayed the completion of their PhD by many years. One particularly illustrates the deep emotional and professional impact of publishing in a predatory journal and said, I quote, "Unfortunately, I had over 20 to 25 papers sacrificed in these journals. They cannot be considered for promotion, and I become a questionable researcher everywhere my CV goes. Everyone looked down on me. I lost a few good friends and even broke into tears once in public because I was so ashamed. It was a truly painful experience," unquote. Then what you can do to minimize others' risks? Well, if you are a researcher or a research supervisor or mentor rather, increase your understanding, raise awareness and practice your own due diligence. If you are an academic member or fellow, encourage your academy to mainstream good publishing and conferencing practice and create disincentives to using fraudulent ones. If you head a university or a higher learning institution, introduce publishing and conferencing good practice into continuous professional development and research integrity courses. And finally, spread the word. We need to be all activists and help curb this predatory practice. You can follow our project using this link and get in touch with us on the indicated email. And last but not least, we would like to thank our funder, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, and our partners, the IAP's regional networks in Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Europe, and the Global Academy of Science, the Global Young Academy, and the World Academy of Sciences. Many thanks for your attention.